to the next podcast, our Digital Health of the Records, where we're going to address the latest news, technology, trends, and obviously give our unfiltered insights and opinions on the things that we're discussing. So, my name is Edwin, and happily accompanied by.
I'm Farrell from Optitrial, and today what we're going to discuss is about payments within clinical trials, which is always an interesting, sometimes contentious topic. And Edwin, so previously you've been a CRA, part of local study teams, so you've got a great background into this. So tapping into the old days, can you give us some of your lived experience when it comes to site payments?
Yes, of course. And yeah, probably wanted to start to say with eventually it's all about the money and paying our site staff is part of doing clinical trials. And yeah, there's, I would say, a lot to still improve here, and we can, as an industry, do a little bit better here. I think it's what I just want to say is most importantly is to for everyone to realize that cash flow and paying sites in a timely manner and pay them purely based on what they deliver and what they've done for studies is extremely important because there are no hospitals are not commercial organizations who have like a good bank account with a lot of spare money. No, it's really they're hospitals and they work a little bit differently. So from that perspective, a lot needs to yeah, it's really important for that cash flow to happen. But doing sort of one step back and focus a little bit on sort of what comes with side payments, it's really about yeah providing them with the financial pieces that are needed to do startup activities, run the clinical trials, uh, up to sort of closeout visits and all the other activities that are associated with studies.
Yeah, so I guess that's kind of part of that first question of, how what things tend to be in scope or not in scope, because I imagine, there's probably some different chunks when it comes to it because you've got all the work that you have to get prepared for being part of the study, feasibility, all the onboarding stuff and trainings. And then, I guess it's probably more time and effort when it comes to how many patients you actually recruit and this study conduct activities. And then, yeah. So what
Yeah,
what have you seen that's kind of in or out of scope typically?
yeah. I think so. This really depends on the sponsor, the country, and maybe even the institutions that you are contracting. And that makes it extremely complex. And it's the larger institutions, for example, who have their own legal and finance department, for example, with whom you sort of negotiate even the prices. And there are smaller hospitals, when they receive sort of their budget, they will do a rough calculation and say, well, we should be covered for this. So, and covered meaning this is the time a certain assessment or certain activities will take, and you're compensated for this amount, and more or less that should be fine. But the larger institutions have even fixed prices for certain assessments, and that is sort of where things sometimes need to be negotiated. Even is that like an AKG? Sometimes people ask, or a hospital asks, just 90 euros for it. But some departments who utilize other groups within the hospital, it is way more complex. It takes more time to take these AKGs. So then the prices go up. So it's never going to be one price or one compensation across the all the sites where it's going to be the same. No, it's something to look into. Do you have experience yourself with, for example, the feasibility, for example, that are included or excluded from these activities?
So from when I've been, speaking to sites, when they're performing feasibility, the site feasibility questionnaires and everything, that tends to be just their they have to cover it themselves because ultimately they're not included in the study at that stage, and that doesn't totally make sense. It's kind of figuring out, are they able to participate, which, it doesn't always work out, which means that
Yeah,
could be a bunch of more sunken costs in this area.
yeah.
So I've heard they don't get covered for that. But I was at a conference recently, or a gathering, and there was some interesting information from some of the people that were, used to work on sites and went to sponsors, that they were quite interested in things like having an understanding of baseline payments. Obviously, there's a lot of variability. You wouldn't
Hmm.
expect the same cost of a site that's within where I am in London compared to something that's, a bit more rural, or in, another country with much lower costs. But I think it could be challenging for maybe one of those naive sites that haven't really got much experience with clinical trials to actually know how much
Hmm.
it is to run it. So have you seen or experienced much of that? Because I know you mentioned about having like some bigger institutions standardizing it quite well, or
Yeah,
do sponsors kind of guide them along the way and give them a
yeah.
fair market value?
Yeah, no, definitely, definitely. I unfortunately, so when I started in this career, you don't know better, so you just negotiate the price and say, yeah, but this is it, and this is common compensation, so you just need to deal with it, and there's no wiggle room here. But the the older and the more experience you get, you start to learn to understand, and even the sites who are new, they say, okay, yeah, well, it seems like a fair compensation for this assessment. But when you start executing a protocol, then you see how things are connected, and that it sometimes is a little bit more cumbersome than just a line item in a protocol design with an X on visit. No, it's not that simple. And then they say, yeah, it was a little bit more tricky and time consuming that we expected. And EDC completion is a good example for that, because when there are bugs in the system, queries are fired and will never get away. So following up on those, and it seems small things, but they are actually really time consuming. And it's EDC queries, it's queries addressing from the central lab, ePro queries. So imagine all the different vendors that you have within a clinical trial. Queries will be raised, and all of that is not so much really covered within the contracts.
Yeah, and another thing, that point that was made by some of the sites were about when there's protocol amendments, it's very quick that, the amendments come along and the expectations picking it up. But they also said that when it came to sorting out the site payment contract updates, that things go a bit quite quickly as well.
Yeah.
Uh,
No, and this is, it's always really hard to predict how many protocol amendments you will have and what the impact is going to be.
mm,
And I'm, but this is really a personal sort of view on this. I rather work under the assumption like, okay, it's a little bit of give and take. You're going to be compensated for and to cover it, but uh, if you need to put a little bit more time and effort into things, then well, we're not going to compensate you for everything. But if it's beyond like what is expected, then things need to be adjusted. And I've seen a lot of, and I think that behavior is accepted. So it's not that the industry doesn't want to move and support that, but you need to be able to address this, and sites need to just speak up. And there's, I think, a misconception that like in the country you don't have the power to challenge the budgets or request for more things to global teams. That's totally not true. If there's a good rationale, there's a good sort of data supporting the request. So yeah, people just need to do that and have that open discussion, and then yeah, we are able to align contracts and the payments much more to the local practice.
Absolutely. I don't think anybody in the industry really, really, really wants to nickel and dime things, because it's excess admin, right? But
No.
I did hear from somebody who works at a sponsor that I won't name
Mhm.
that an interesting case, which is you can kind of see where sometimes sites might try to, I suppose, position themselves in a certain way. When it came to using ECOA and ePro,
Mhm.
basically within the calculations of what that
Yeah.
sponsor were paying sites or reimbursing them for their time and effort, they said that it was the sites would get less money for using ePro eCOA rather than using the paper. So obviously that means to the site they want to use the paper because they'll get paid more for it, right?
Yeah.
Despite the fact there's, the hidden costs of,
Yeah.
like you mentioned, queries or troubleshooting or
Yeah.
whatever else.
Yeah. I would say though, this type of example, it's more the exception than the rule. And
Yeah, it was very bizarre when she described it. It's
Of
like,
course,
really?
of course, no, but I think it is fair to say, and this is I'm not saying anything new, is that in a way doing clinical trials is a business model, and meaning that you've got the large institutes who have a huge organization and people on their payroll, and doing clinical trials does bring in a certain amount of income, or it keeps people on the job. And it's not that it's not that they're making profit. I'm not saying that, but well, if you do not have those studies anymore, then you need to do something with the staff that you have. That means that you've got too much overhead. So in a way, it's as said, it's a business model, which is not there's nothing wrong with it. But again, the I would say the exception that you just described is yeah not making the right decisions in my mind because
Yeah. And maybe another question from your experience, because something that's kind of an interesting case, especially where, sponsors are pushing that sites have to use more like patient registries and recruitment suppliers that they're pushing through, which ultimately can lead to the sites having to screen or process a lot of patients that just aren't fit for the trial and end up as screen fails. That takes up a lot of time and effort, but are sites still getting compensated when it comes to processing or going
yeah.
through like screening with those patients?
Yeah, I think this is a really good example, and I would say yes and no. Um, the advantage of the I'm going to say more professional sites is that they know exactly how clinical trials are run and that they all already want to have included into their contracts the true compensation for all the startup activities and screening activities that they do and screen failures and so forth. But it's not part of a standard contract, so it's customized. But um, yeah, if you've got like a little bit of an immature team with not so much experience and you take your standard contract template, you're not going to include this because the payments are generally done based on the protocol assessment schedules. And I'm going to say, and I don't have any facts that or insights that prove me otherwise, but what I've seen is it's literally the assessment schedule. There's a price tag to each assessment, and that's the compensation that's being paid per visit. And then additionally, some other line items will be added. But the source of sort of where it all starts, the whole compensation starts with the assessment schedule. The all the feasibility activities are not reflected in there. So I believe that we are using the wrong source in order to do the budgeting for
Mhm.
studies, and therefore, like the true compensation for screening all patients is sometimes missed, purely because it just drowns in all the other type of information that goes around during startup activities.
And
Yeah.
maybe tapping into another kind of expense that may not be totally appreciated by, let's say, the less institutional type sites, because I know that often sites have to bear the brunt of patient reimbursements whilst they're awaiting getting reimbursed by their sponsor. of the trial. So have you seen sort of how that works, or what kind of tools or options are available?
Yeah, that's and I know that there are vendors out there that have tools to support the side payments. And again, the majority is based on connecting with an EDC, connecting with CTMS systems that um, sort of capture monitoring visit reports, and the combination of it. If you link this with your price tags, then payments are being done. But it's not standard. And if it's not standard, what it means, and unfortunately, is that people keep track on payments using Excel or other type of sort of software tools, not really dedicated tools. And what it ends up, and it results in that delays of payment because you need to gather your own source of information. It's not always correct, and it's a huge manual effort here. And in some contracts, it's stated that it takes like 60 days until we've received an invoice. So it's what's happening. The sponsors give the sites an overview of what has been done, and they can create an invoice based on that information. That's sort of a little bit the standard. Whereas normally the invoicing is done differently. It's like, hey, you would expect that the site would keep track on their own expenses, and that's just an invoice. So that's already causing part of the delay. It's the sponsor who, in principle, triggers that piece. And if the site, for whatever reason, forgets to send that invoice, then they're not getting paid until that invoice is being sent. And then you need to imagine that sometimes there's a 60 or 90 days payment cycle, and that
Yeah.
for some sites it's really tricky. And there are different sort of per country regulations where it's sort of fixed. You can't do anything about it. But for sites, yeah, it's worth challenging actually.
Exactly, because that could end up being a good chunk of money, especially where, a lot of, especially when we're trying to get more community sites involved in trials that, they're not big institutions. And depending on the healthcare system, they could be literally running,
Yeah,
to, you know, they don't have the money to keep afloat based
yeah,
on that,
yeah. No,
which doesn't
I
seem
don't think,
fair.
no, true. I tell you, you're completely right here. And but I don't think a lot of people really realize this. And I also need to say there are not a lot of sites who really dare to say something like this.
Mm.
So, and I know I'm going to call out her name anyway, although we're quite discreet, but this is a good thing. Like Vivienne van der Wal, she's really about sort of advocating for sites, and she really is very transparent about this. Like, hey, I've got a business to run, and if you're not paying me, then yeah, well, um, that's going to be an issue at a certain point of time. And if people tell and share these stories, then people are more, yeah, conscious
Hmm.
about these things and don't leave it just as the finance as a side thing. It's equally important to follow up on your finance as closing your database log.
Exactly, and I've heard as well this week from some sites that they've literally similarly had to say that when they weren't getting paid that okay, well, we're not going to release the data to you. So it's that kind of thing of when they have to take such an extreme measure, it's
Mm,
yeah, weird that it gets to that situation when it's you should be getting reimbursed or paid for services performed in this
yeah,
world,
no,
right?
indeed. Yeah, yeah, and this is when we talk about sort of payments within clinical trials. Paying sites is one thing. The
Hmm.
other bridge that I want to make is towards the patients and reimbursing patients within clinical trials, which I would say is the next level of complexity a little in doing payments. But I would guess you've heard and experienced um, these type of things yourself as well, though.
Yeah, exactly. And, it is reimbursing them for their time and effort and anything that they've to, you know, the cost of participation, essentially, whether that's, meals when they're on site at a visit, or if they have to pay for parking, or any other travel expenses if they're going by train, even down to more simple things like, the data they might have to use as part of their plan to participate too, because at the end of the day, if they're using the data as part of the clinical trial and then they can't use it in their personal life, it's not fair, and it would be a reason that they may not want to continue or complete the trial, right? Which it's definitely like one of the it could become a barrier to being able to participate in the trial, not just the short term, but in the longer term too.
No, definitely. And I think I would say where you would see this is not so much within the recruitment, but more on the retention. So if people are participating in a very sort of heavy clinical study where they need to come in frequent or complex assessments, and if there's no compensation at all, and I'm going to say this like this, is because it's not a standard that things will be compensated for. So maybe in some cases it was not unless someone is asking for it. But if then the patient runs into these kind of things, if they need to pay a parking ticket here in the Netherlands, I'm paying sometimes 15 euros for parking my car at the hospital for just 2 hours. And if you're a clinical trial patient, you will be there for 2 hours for sure. Which is, I think, yeah. And if you need to do this every month, then yeah, it's going to be impactful. So yeah,
Especially
that needs to
since
be.
it's, I mean, they're the kind of like hard cost, right? But then there's the other things as well, like for example, if they're really ill, they need to have a caregiver go with them. So it's,
Yeah,
does that caregiver get their travel reimbursed too if they need it? Or, you know, uh, even simple things, like the cost of having to take a day off work to participate is another
yeah,
thing that could become a longer term challenge for retention, like you said.
yeah. No, and in all honesty, I don't think we will end up in a situation where everything will be covered. But yeah, you need to find the right balance here. At least
Mhm.
no compensation or reimbursement for these things. I think that's a no-go. I don't think we should accept that. But yeah, you can't cover for all the cost. That's sort of the other side of the scale. But
Mm.
yeah, people need to like study teams, and I'm going to say addressing this to like the global teams who are responsible for the overall budget and the local teams responsible for the local budgets. Yeah, they need to really sort of look into this and really take this into account from the start, because if you don't take this into account from the start when you set up your study budget, it's really hard to get that additional funding. And if you look at the overall cost eventually, so meaning what does a study cost, these are not the most significant and impactful costs. Yes, the sum
Uh,
is large, but
but I mean, at the end of the day, patients or participants, they're volunteering their time and efforts, and there are no clinical trials if we don't have them, right? So,
yeah,
and there's been so much about, there only 2 to 5% of people who could participate do join a clinical trial. So we have to do something
yeah,
to break down the barriers that could
yeah,
block participation,
yeah,
especially in the cost of living crisis that is pretty global at the moment as well, right?
yeah, yeah, indeed. Do you think that digital will be something as seen as part of the solution? Not saying that digital will be the solution, but
I think yes and no, and it depends on solution to who, because there are solutions out there that, take away that cost burden from the patients so they can have preloaded credit cards and apps that they can use to cover travel costs and so on. But to sites, I also heard last week that they preferred not to use them because it's the same challenge that there's so many different vendors in the space, and they would rather work with the process they know that works for them, just
Mhm.
because it can be a challenge otherwise. So they said, one site in particular said that they took a very hard stance and said, we're only going to do it where we reimburse the patients as well. And I have also heard that that can impact the contracts that sponsors have with their sites too. Have you seen that as well?
No, I don't think so. No,
Okay.
no. No, so and yeah, what I've seen here in the at least in the Netherlands, we didn't really had issues with the compensation. It's the thinking from ethical committees because it's an ethical committee eventually who needs to approve the compensation or the reimbursement, and the thinking here is that the financial pieces shouldn't be the trigger for a patient to participate.
Hmm.
And
Exactly.
I think everyone agrees with this. No?
Yeah, because we don't want to inflate professional patients that are treating it as a job. We want to make sure that they're, actually in it for the right reasons.
Yeah, we didn't talk about new topics yet, but the professional patient is not a fictive story. It's really there, which is really interesting. No, but you don't want to end up in those situations for sure. No.
Absolutely. So, are there any other points that you'd like to make as part of payments in trials? Other than, let's try and make sure that we're doing right by everybody involved?
Yeah. No, I think again the patient reimbursement is um, it's a difficult one. I said I think in January we need to compensate for yeah the burden and especially the meals and those kind of things. But I also know that it's a little bit more complex than just yeah moving and providing them with the cost here. So yeah, now maybe you want to drop something here, but
I think that's probably it, other than, yeah, the cost of everything is going crazy in the world these days. So it's definitely something that the patients need to be front and center, especially if we're going to try and break down any socioeconomic barriers to participation to try and increase, how many patients can participate in a trial.
yeah, no, indeed, I think maybe then to close sort of this topic, I think um, it will continue to stay here, but we need to think a little bit more carefully and be open to this at the start
Hmm.
and truly make a good compensation and reimburse for really the things that we all believe that patients need to be reimbursed for. And I really hope that sort of with the technology, and we discussed this with other techs as well, that we come to a couple of sort of tools out there that are really supportive and really are able to make this more efficient. And by throwing too many new solutions who can help here a little bit and there, yeah, that's
Hmm.
eventually not going to work. So yeah, that's more a challenge to the tech vendors here to carefully to look at this and help sites here.
Absolutely. And as well, make sure when you're planning for inflation adjustment as well over the course of long-term studies. Otherwise, your budget could take a very crazy turn when it comes to
Yeah.
expenses.
Yeah, that's another good one. That's uh, also forgotten a lot.
Yeah,
And
it's
you will get that question if you've got more on a side level finance people looking into these type of contracts rather than a research nurse who's really dedicated with a physician who
mhm,
is doing clinical trials. They will come to the conclusion like 5 year follow up. It's like, hey, the cost of living has increased a little bit, but yeah, this doesn't cover it anymore. Yeah, yeah, that's a really good
exactly.
one.
Great. So, shall we close out for the day?
Yeah,
Um, Yeah, so let us know what you thought and leave us comments, messages, anything you want. Send us some love, send us some engagement. And yeah, join us next time on the next topic.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks. Bye.